How does one become involved in organized crime? There's been an ongoing debate raging for decades now on whether or not poverty drives crime or crime drives poverty. Regardless of which way it actually is, it's painfully obvious that poverty and crime go hand in hand. However, poverty isn't the sole reason that someone might become involved in crime. The lifestyle can be very alluring to certain people. The respect that comes with it, the money that comes with it can be very appealing. It's easy to look at people who are involved with organized crime as simply being greedy monsters. Now, while this might be mostly true, no one is born as a monster. Everyone, even the worst of the worst, starts out as a newborn, innocent babe. Although it's an unfortunate fact that if you're living this type of life, you're likely to become a victim of it yourself. Now, do your own crimes make you somehow less of a victim, considering that you put yourself in that situation in the first place? Personally, I'm not really sure, but it's an interesting question nonetheless. Although, as we go through today's story, just try and keep in mind that no one is born as a monster. We all start out as innocent. So let's set the scene. We're in the Republic of Ireland on January 12th of the year 2020. Drogheda is a port city in the county of Louth. Drogheda isn't a huge town by any means, with the population hovering around 45,000 as of 2022. However, like most cities, Drogheda has a problem with gangs. Being a gang member is a young man's game, and unfortunately, all too often, youths are snapped up by these illicit groups. I mean, it's not too hard to see the appeal, especially for young men. There's a certain status that comes from being in a gang, a certain mystique. Regardless of the brutal reality, it is this perception that often leads young men into making terrible and usually life-altering decisions. Today, we're going to take a look at one such case. Keane Mulready Woods was a local teenager who was born on the 2nd of February of the year 2003. During his early years, Keane loved nothing more than taking his dirt bike out for a spin. However, around the year 2018, Keane took an unfortunate turn to organized crime, at the tender age of just 15 years old. Sadly, this kind of story is all too common these days. Keane quickly garnered himself a reputation as being an extremely violent young man, one who could fly off the rails at the slightest provocation. For the Woods family, the day of January 12, 2020 began much like any other. However, before nightfall, everything had changed. Their beloved Keane was missing, and no one had a single clue as to where he could be. On the following afternoon, Keane's sister took to social media to post a desperate plea for knowledge concerning her brother's whereabouts. The last time that Keane had been seen by anyone was the previous evening when he'd been spotted near his home. Earlier that same day, Keane had actually phoned his mother in order to ask to borrow some money for a cab ride home. After that phone call had ended, no one, not his family nor his friends, had seen a single glimpse of him. Obviously, something was very wrong here. The family, hoping for a miracle, described to the authorities the blue tracksuit that Keane had been seen wearing on the day of his disappearance. The authorities, meanwhile, were already very familiar with Keane and knew that his family had very good reason to be worried. After all, the police were well aware of the existence of a video that had recently been posted to social media by a local criminal. Within this video, an unknown man repeatedly made threats to murder the teenager, and these were threats that the authorities were taking very seriously. During this period of time, the little city of Drogheda was embroiled in a deadly gang war. And this war had only escalated as Keane had reached his formative years. So, like so many others before him, Keane would make the terrible choice to join a gang. Perhaps if he had grown up somewhere else, away from all the violence, Keane's life would have turned out very differently, but we'll never really know for sure. The violence in the streets of the city had gotten so bad, it reached the point where entire sections of it were labeled as quote-unquote no-go zones. These were areas where gangs flourished, and regular citizens would do their very best to avoid. Despite the alluring promise and seduction of money, clothes, drugs, and women, it wouldn't be long before Keane was in over his head. Keane jumped in head first, dealing drugs for his gang, just as the feud between the two groups was escalating drastically. This feud went far beyond just taunts on social media. These gang members existed in a world where violence wasn't just normal, but commonplace. Keane's gang was known to routinely carry weapons, and they certainly weren't afraid to use them. In particular, they had a tendency towards making various kinds of bombs. When we think of gang warfare, we don't often think of explosives. Keane's gang would then utilize these bombs in order to lay waste to their rivals' hideouts. And it wouldn't be long at all before Keane was enthusiastically diving headfirst into the violence. In the year 2019, Keane firebombed the home of a man who owed the gang money. There were no casualties, but this one act perfectly demonstrated Keane's alarming tendencies toward violence. Following this incident, Keane was arrested by the authorities and charged with possession of controlled substances. Rumors also spread that Keane had sadistically tortured and killed the pet cat of a woman who hadn't paid the gang back on time. I think it's pretty safe to say that Keane more than thoroughly earned his violent reputation. So obviously, by the time of his disappearance, Keane was already very well known to police. However, some certain information only came to light after Keane was reported as missing. By this time, the authorities had managed to piece together the movements of the teenager over the prior months, leading all the way up to his mysterious disappearance. But little did the authorities and Keane's family know, it was already far too late.
Alice.
There are some things that are burned into your memory, things that you wish you could just erase, but you can't. You see them every time you close your eyes. Only a few hours after Keane's sister had initially posted to social media, a lone man was walking down a road in Dublin when he came across a sports duffel bag. As the man pulled back the zipper of the duffel bag, he was greeted with a truly horrible sight. Inside the bag was a collection of severed human limbs, and next to these, oddly, were a pair of flip-flops. Around approximately 1:30 a.m. the following morning, officers received a report of a vehicle on fire. After dousing the flames, firefighters discovered a human head and a pair of human hands entangled in the wreckage. DNA testing would then go on to prove that all of these belonged to Keane. However, the pair of flip-flops were not his, with the authorities interpreting these as a threat to the rest of Keane's gang. You see, months prior to the murder of the teenager, a 35-year-old opposing gang member was attacked on the street in broad daylight as he was just leaving the gym. The man was wearing a pair of flip-flops during the attack, and these were stolen throughout the course of the violence. The gang members then posed for a photo with the stolen shoes, afterwards posting it along with a mocking caption to social media. It seems that Keane and the rest of his gang had no idea who they were really dealing with, though. Perhaps if they did, they never would have went through with the assault in the first place. After all, as we all know, hindsight is often 20/20. The individual who owned the pair of flip-flops was a man named Robbie Lawler. Keane might have had a reputation of being a violent person, but Robbie's reputation was something else entirely. Robbie was actually an assassin for a local gang known as the Anti-Maguire faction, and it wouldn't be long before Robbie became the prime suspect in the killing of Keane. Robbie was also very well known to the authorities as well. He was the prime suspect in the murder of not one, not two, not three, but 4 other people. His reputation on the streets was vicious, and even the other members of his own gang knew better than to take him lightly. Despite being the prime suspect in 4 separate homicide cases, Robbie was released from prison just 1 month before Keane's murder. This time though, Robbie's good luck would run dry when an associate of his would lead the authorities right to the door of the home where Keane was murdered. Gerard McKenna, the owner of the home, informed police that Robbie had threatened his life and the life of his children if he didn't adequately clean up the scene of the crime for him. When Gerard arrived at the home, however, he found far too much blood to be able to clean up the entirety of it. Following the discovery of Keane's partial remains, the authorities released a statement referring to what happened to Keane as a, quote, brutal and savage attack. Keane's family was extremely distraught over their son's murder, and especially the way that his body had been mutilated and thrown away like trash. There was hope, however, that they'd be able to recover the rest of Keane's remains and give him a proper burial. In April of the year 2020, 3 months later, the last remaining pieces of Keane's corpse were discovered in his hometown. His remains were located lying in an overgrown bush down in a ravine. This hasn't been confirmed, but it's believed that Robbie had ordered his associates to deliver Keane's torso to the home of one of their biggest rivals, but when the police managed to find the duffel bag that contained Keane's severed limbs so quickly, they panicked and just dumped the rest of the remains instead. However, since so much time had passed, a large section of Keane's torso had unfortunately been consumed by animals. Apparently, at least according to the media, Keane had been officially warned by the authorities on the 5th of January 2020 that his life could be in danger. It was also suspected that recently Keane had been trying to play both sides of the gang war raging in his city. It's believed that this is yet another reason that the teenager had been targeted. Keane was known to wear a bulletproof vest almost constantly due to all the credible threats upon his life. Following all of these revelations, 2 other suspects were then taken into custody. These men were rival gang members, Paul Crosby and Gerard Cruz. On the same day that Keane had disappeared, he had actually met up with Paul Crosby. The 2 men met outside a local shop in the city before Keane got into a vehicle with Paul and Gerard. Keane was then tortured in gruesome fashion, with the killer utilizing various kinds of power tools during his sadistic task. The teen was also stabbed numerous times at his torso. It's been rumored that this brutal murder was actually recorded and filmed by the perpetrators, although this has not been confirmed. Following the completion of the foul deed, Keane's corpse was then cut up and dismembered by the killer. There's there's no evidence to suggest that the other two men, Paul Crosby and Gerard Cruz, were present at the scene of the crime when Keane was killed. However, they were responsible for luring the teenager to his death. Despite the fact that Robbie was the prime suspect in Keane's murder almost from the very beginning, he was never actually arrested or even charged with the crime. This was due to the fact that Robbie was actually shot to death in a gang-related shooting not too long after the initial discovery of Keane's remains. The only semblance of justice that occurred in this case was Paul Crosby and Gerard Cruz both being charged in relation to Keane's death. Paul Crosby received a sentence of 10 years, while Gerard Cruz was sentenced to 7. The two men pleaded guilty to the charges of soliciting Keane's murder. Gerard, the man who owned the home where Keane was killed and cleaned up the scene afterwards, was given a 4-year sentence. Despite these 3 convictions, it's quite hard to say that justice was actually served in this case. You know, there's no such thing as a perfect victim. Was Keane the perfect person? Was he even a good person? I'll leave that up to you to decide. However, it's very hard for me to make the case that he somehow deserved what he got due to his previous actions. I'm not sure anyone deserves that. Remember, we are all born as innocent.